Great. Well, thank you so much, Hideaki. It's really good to be here. Really great to present to Rieti. So what I'm speaking about, as Hideaki said, is on the power of purposeful business, how great companies can deliver both purpose and profit. Now, we hear the word purpose many times. It's a very popular word, but I actually have a quite different view about what it means to be purposeful to what you typically hear. And to explain my different view, let me start with an example. So let me take you on a journey away from your offices to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches across two continents, from Lebanon in Asia to Mozambique in Africa. And it has some of the world's highest mountains, like this one, but also some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Miali, which is in the Kenyan stretch of the Great Rift Valley. Now, fewer than 1,000 people call this lake their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Saronga, who makes a living selling goats. Now, for Emmanuel, it used to be that cash was king. So when he sold a goat, he'd receive some cash, but he then had to check that cash in case it was stolen or forged. He'd have to store that cash and worry about it being robbed. And then to bank that cash, he had to walk for an entire day to get to the nearest bank. So Emmanuel's life was tough. He couldn't graze his goats in the greenest pastures. He always had to be one day from a bank. But all of this changed due to a purposeful business. And this business is Vodafone, the UK telecoms company. Because in 2007, Vodafone launched M-Pesa, a mobile money service in Kenya. And what this does is it allows people to transfer money from phone to phone as easily as you can send a text message. So this was a way that you could do banking without having access to a bank. Now, this completely transformed Emmanuel's life. He doesn't need to deal with cash anymore. He doesn't need to worry about robbery or forgery, and he can graze his goats where he wants to. But this is not a story about one person. It's a story about hundreds of thousands of people, because in the first 7 years of launching M-Pesa, Vodafone lifted 200,000 households out of poverty. And many of these households are headed up by women. It allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail, so there's a large effect on gender equality. So that's one story I'm telling you about Vodafone. But let me now tell you a different story. And this different story surrounds tax. Because in 2012, Vodafone became the first telecoms company around the world to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they're paying to governments worldwide. And obviously, tax transparency is very important in telecoms. You could choose to locate your licenses in low tax jurisdictions. So why am I starting my talk with these two stories? It's to ask you these two questions. First is, which of these decisions, launching M-Pesa or releasing the tax transparency report, created most value for society? And the second is, which of these decisions, if it had not been taken, would have led to the most public outrage or worsen Vodafone's ESG rating or reputation? I'm not going to poll anybody because we're going to have a lot of time at the end for questions. And the reason for not polling people is most people agree with the answer. Which decision created most value for society? It was the first one. By launching M-Pesa, Vodafone lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and contributed to gender equality. But if I turn to the second question, what would have been the public outrage if Vodafone had not launched M-Pesa? It would have been nothing. There would have been no media boycott. There would have been no backlash by customers because nobody would have ever thought it was possible to do something crazy like banking without a bank, like mobile money. But what is the consequence of not being transparent on tax? Indeed, it could be huge. Vodafone themselves suffered a nationwide boycott of their stores because of concerns they had not paid enough tax. So this is why I am highlighting I have a different view of purpose to what we typically think about. Often we think that purpose is about trying to answer that second question. Purposeful businesses should do no harm. They should not cheat on taxes. They should not pollute the environment. They should not mistreat their workers. And of course, that is part of purpose, to do no harm. But what I'd like to do is to change our thinking towards answering that first question. Purpose is also about actively creating value for society. It's not just about avoiding a scandal, but it's about creating value even if you were not expected to do this. Why? Because if you create value for society, ultimately, this can turn into financial value. And indeed, Vodafone themselves were able to turn M-Pesa into a revenue stream by charging a small transaction, a small percentage of every transaction. So this highlights the different view of purpose that I have. It's moving from doing no harm to actively doing good. So why do I think that that is the correct way to think about purpose? Well, first, you have the moral and ethical case. Given the challenge the world faces today, it's not enough for a company to just do no harm. The company needs to actively do good and solve all of the challenges in the world. But it's not just the moral and ethical case, there is also a business and financial case. And to demonstrate that business and financial case, let me use the framework of growing the pie. So what is the pie? We can think about the pie as the value that a company creates. And it can be divided between investors in the form of profits, that's the blue, and society in the form of fair taxes, fair wages, fair prices, that is the orange. And we often think that purpose is about splitting the pie differently, paying higher taxes than we can get away with, paying more to employees, and so on. However, this is problematic. Why? Because it's not good for investors. Often we think that investors are nameless, faceless capitalists. Investors are them. Society is us. If we can take from them and give to us, then everybody is better off. But investors are not them. They are us. They include pension funds like the Japanese government pension investment fund, investing for retirement. They include insurance companies funding future claims. So any repurposing of business needs to take investors seriously. So this is why my view about purpose is that it's about growing the pie. So yes, we do want to increase the orange, but the way that we increase the orange is not through redistribution. It's not by giving a greater slice of what's already there, but it's through innovation, through excellence, through coming up with this bold and innovative idea like M-Pesa, like launching banking without a bank. Because if you create value for society, ultimately people will be willing to pay you for it, and then this in turn turns into a profit. Now, you might be skeptical and you might think, do you really need a pie-growing, purposeful mindset in order to innovate and create value? You might think, shouldn't I just care about profit? For example, if you are a car company, would you invest in electric cars? Well, the answer is yes. Even if you don't care about climate change, you will build electric cars because there is money to be made. You could build a spreadsheet. You could forecast the revenues from the car company. We know that there is uncertainty, but we know how to deal with uncertainty. We use a sensitivity analysis. But if we think about Vodafone and M-Pesa, this would have never been justified by a spreadsheet calculation. The net present value of this is hugely negative. The tech challenges are huge, and even if they manage to succeed, where would the money be made from serving some of the poorest people in the world? So, this is why Vodafone had a purpose, and their purpose was to build a digital society that enhances socioeconomic progress. And if you do that, then that will inspire you to do something like M-Pesa, and that ultimately turns into profit. So purpose is fundamentally different from long-term profit maximization. If you maximize long-term profits, you do indeed take good decisions, like building the electric car factory, where you can calculate, at least roughly, the impact of your decisions on profit. However, if you're launching something like M-Pesa, you can't do that calculation, so purpose is necessary in order to try. Now, at this point in my talk, 10 minutes in, you might think, well, everything I say sounds great, but where is the evidence? It seems a bit like wishful thinking. If I indeed create value for society, then magically profits will appear. But where is the evidence? I've come up with one example of one company, but how do you know that I didn't handpick this one example? Because it's one that works. So this is why the bulk of what I do is to look at large-scale data. Now, with this, we have to be very careful of confirmation bias, the fact that people are willing to accept evidence if it confirms what they'd like to be true. And this is a particular problem with responsible business. And so I highlighted this in a TED talk a few years ago, what to trust in a post-truth world, about how careful we need to be about evidence if it's on a topic that I feel strongly. And just to give you an example, Forbes, a very well-respected business magazine, said that companies that excel in their sustainability outperform their peers financially. Nothing wrong with that. That's just a description of a study. But here is the problem. That is the premise of a new report, and it is an accurate one, judging by many conversations with those interested in better business, better governance, and a sustainable future. So how did the journalists judge whether the report was accurate? Not by looking at the methodology, nor by the scientific accuracy, but just by asking people who already believe in purpose, do you think that the result is accurate? And of course, they would say yeah. So in order for me to present something to Rieti, I need to make sure that it's based on more than wishful thinking, it's based on evidence. And so this is something that I looked at a few years ago. Does purpose actually pay off? So how did I measure purpose? I looked at the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. These are companies that go above and beyond in how they treat their workers. This is linked to my definition of purpose at the start. It's about actively doing good, not just doing no harm. I don't just look at reducing your injuries and reducing your redundancies, but I look at providing your employees with a healthy and rich place to work. Now, you might think, why do I look at employees? Shouldn't I look at the environment? Because climate is really important. Well, climate is important, but it's not important for every single industry. So in some industries, it may well be that actually, like tech, climate is not really important to you. But employees are important for every industry. And so what I found was the 100 best companies to work for in America. These are companies that go above and beyond in how they treat their workers. They deliver shareholder returns that beat their peers, by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. So companies that are treating their workers well, they are not splitting the pie differently, grabbing some pie at the expense of shareholders, but instead they're growing the pie, workers become more motivated, more productive, more likely to stay, and ultimately shareholders become better off. Now, you might be skeptical again. You might think, well, is it that employee satisfaction causes financial performance? Maybe it's the reverse. Once the company is already performing well, then it can start to treat its employees better. Or maybe there are common factors that affect both. Maybe even in the tech industry, employers are happy. And also if you're in the tech industry, then that industry has performed well. So I have to do a lot of tests to suggest that it's the first that causes the second, rather than the reverse. So in the final part of my talk, let me talk about putting it into practice. So the first part is what is purpose. It's about growing the pie, not splitting the pie. It's about actively doing good, not just doing no harm. The second part of my talk was there is evidence that if you create value for society, that ultimately helps shareholders. But then the third part is how do we actually grow the pie? And so let's go to the word purpose. As I mentioned at the start of my talk, this word is very common nowadays, but it's often misunderstood. So we often see companies which say our purpose is to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, and communities, and invest. That sounds great. We serve everybody, but it's unrealistic because there are trade-offs. We can't help suppliers and the environment because you can do something which benefits one and hurts the other. If I close down a polluting plant, that's good for the environment, but it's bad for my employees. So if we think about what does the word purpose mean in the English language, it means being focused. If I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately. If I hold a purposeful meeting, that is a meeting with a clear agenda. So I define purpose as why a company exists, who it serves, its reason for being, and the role that it plays in the world. And now that might seem a bit lofty and idealistic, but let me pick it apart. Why you exist, who you serve, your reason for being, and the role that you play, they all have to be targeted. So how does a company decide why it exists? This is what I call should be based on the principle of comparative advantage. What are you good at? What are the problems in the world that you are uniquely best placed to solve? It cannot be to solve all 17 sustainable development goals, but to focus on the couple that you can really move the needle. So if there's only one thing that you remember from my talk, it is this. Ask yourself the question, what is in my hand? What are the resources? What is the expertise that my company has? And how can I use these resources and this expertise to serve society if I think a little bit more creatively? So for Vodafone, what they had in their hand was telecoms expertise, and they used this to transfer mobile money. Before they could send text messages, now they allowed you to be able to text money. And we've seen this in many Japanese companies. So what does Toyota have in their hand? It's manufacturing expertise. And so in the pandemic, they use this to make masks and face shields. What about Eisai Pharmaceuticals? Their expertise is obviously making drugs. And so they manufacture DEC tablets to control this serious disease, lymphatic filariasis, and they donated those tablets free to countries in which this was endemic. But notice that this is quite different to how many companies think about purpose, where rather than looking internally at what is in my hand, they look externally on what is active in the media. So when George Floyd gets murdered, then companies start donating to Black Lives Matter. Clearly, I'm somebody who cares about racial equality, but if you are Toyota, you don't have expertise as to whether Black Lives Matter is a better charity than the American Cancer Society or Doctors Without Borders. So actually, charitable donations does not use your expertise. They were absolutely right to focus on using their manufacturing know-how to make masks and face shields. The second part is the idea of materiality. Remember, purpose is why you exist. Why do I exist? What problems do I want to solve? It's based on what I'm good at, my comparative advantage. Who I'm serving, that is based on materiality, what is important to me. And so this is a virtuous circle. If I'm using my comparative advantage, then shareholders can create a large bang for buck. They are actually able to create a lot of value for stakeholders. And if these are material stakeholders to me, then the value that I create will ultimately turn into shareholder value. And so let's give another Japanese example. Yamaha makes outboard motors for fishing. And so what is material to them is their customers. Now, you might think customers are material to every company, but here what they did is they went above and beyond just making great motors. They gave a free fishery journal to teach methods of catching, processing, and selling fish. Why? Because if they sustain successful farmers, then obviously a successful farming community will mean more demand for motors. But also they worked on supply chain partners. It's not just important to design and manufacture good outboard motors, but they need to be repaired. And so they recruited and trained local mechanics to be able to repair them. So in the final few minutes of my talk, let me think about how, after defining our purpose in terms of what is in our hand, our comparative advantage, and what is material to us, how do we put our purpose into practice? And this involves 3 steps. First is doing new things. So generating new business, new products and services, or finding new clients. Now, you might think, shouldn't any company try to generate new business? But when a normal company tries to generate business, they are based on whether this will create financial value. Instead, what a purposeful company looks at is, will this serve society? I've given an example of new products and services in terms of M-Pesa. What about an example of finding new clients driven by the desire to serve society? One of the big banks in the UK is NatWest. And until a couple of weeks ago, it was run by Alison Rose. And before she became CEO, the UK government invited her to do a Rose review, which found that £250 billion of value could be added to the UK economy if women could get the same access to financing as men. So how did she come up with this number? Well, when you are giving access, lending to entrepreneurs, a small business does not have a long track record of accounts. So you have to base it on things such as the confidence of the entrepreneur. And obviously men do much better on this than women, and so this is a barrier to access. But this is not just an issue for women, it's also ethnic minorities. In the UK, it's people outside London and the southeast, or it's people without a degree. So driven by the desire to create value for society, Alison Rose defined it as one of her 3 pillars of her purpose to provide fair access to funds for entrepreneurs. And note that even if this was something driven by serving society, ultimately it grows the pie and turns into profit. Because if NatWest is able to lend to these customers that all of their competitors are turning down, then it will be able to get some business that its rivals will not. The second part is to do the same thing in different ways. And so why I highlight this is often people think, oh, with purpose, we need to come up constantly with new products and services, but there's obviously a limit to how many new things you can come up with. But purpose might involve smaller things. Let's do the same thing that we've already done, but let's do it with a spirit of excellence. Now, you might think, shouldn't any company strive to be excellent? Well, it will do if it's something that allows it to make money, but a purposeful company will pursue excellence even in avenues that are not clearly linked to profits. For example, Vodafone put as much effort into launching M-Pesa as it would in its normal customer service. And innovation might not just be innovation in the products that you create, but in how you manufacture those products. For example, let's say you are a pharmaceuticals company. Maybe in the past you used a lot of animal testing. But now you might think, because this imposes pain and suffering on animals, let me try to innovate, let me try to come up with chemical testing or testing with computer simulations. And again, that's good for society, that reduces pain and suffering to animals, but it's also good for business because animals are expensive, and so this allows you to do your testing in more cost-effective ways. Now, the final thing is to do the same thing in exactly the same way, but to recognize the purpose of what you're doing. Some of you might know this picture. 3 people are working. One says, I am laying bricks. The second is, I'm earning a salary to feed my family. And the third says, I am building a cathedral. So they're doing exactly the same thing, but only the third recognizes the ultimate purpose. And so this is something that many participants here can do. I believe that we have many senior people in the audience. And because of your seniority, you might be able to see the ultimate impact of your products and services that your company is offering, and now report that internally to your employee. So going back to NatWest one final time, when the lockdown was over, Alison Rose took her senior management team out to a dinner in a restaurant in London called the Darjeeling Express. And she had the owner of that restaurant give a little talk. And the owner, called Asma Khan, she said, when I came to the UK 30 years ago, nobody believed in me. I'm a woman, I'm an immigrant. Women immigrants are not your idea of an entrepreneur. People think about white men like Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg. But NatWest, you believed in me. You gave me a loan. You allowed me to start this restaurant, and this restaurant I've served hundreds of customers, given dozens of employees jobs. So let's say you were the NatWest loan officer, which approved that loan. Maybe you get 10 loan applications in a day, you approve 3 of them, you reject 7, you don't think about what happens afterwards. But if you realize that if I am to approve a loan, this will allow an entrepreneur to fulfill her dream and be able to generate jobs and have customers, then maybe the next time I have to look at a loan, I might spend a little more of my time doing this. I might be more diligent because I understand how much value this creates for wider society. Okay, so this is the end of my talk, and what this webinar is marking is the launch of the book Grow the Pie into Japanese. And I'm delighted that it's come out in Japan. It's coming out, or has come out, in 9 other countries. But in particular, Japan has always been a country where long-term thinking has been at the heart of what it does. And so I hope that this webinar has been really helpful to you to highlight how this is good, not just for society, but also the long-term success of the company. So let me hand back to Hideaki to hand over to my fellow panelists about her experiences of thinking about purpose in practice.